Okay, so we'll go ahead and get started then. Today's session, I'm going to be going through a spouse client file from start to finish, just to show you sort of how to use the system, how it will work going through a client file. And today's session is going to be really open-ended. So anytime you have a question, just feel free to jump right in, or if you want, you can also send it through the Zoom chat. I think Jordy has just joined us for a quick hello. Jordy, do you want to say hello?
Hi, guys. Just wanted to say hi. And Michaela's going to take you through sort of the user experience. But just to remind you that I'm around to answer any questions from a practicing lawyer's point of view. Because I use this obviously every single client. So I've used it hundreds and hundreds of times and can probably give you some tips and or help you through anything. So good luck, and you're in good hands with Michaela. So hope you find it useful.
Thanks,
Take care.
Jordy.
You bet.
So hopefully everybody can see my screen, but this is the screen you first get to when you log into the system, and it's going to list all the clients that you've added to the system. So to add a new client, you're just going to go up to the Add button, and the key details are going to be first name and last name. So we're going to call this client Ben Collins. Then this email field is here if you want to send the client the online questionnaire. So you'd put in their email, you'd click this use questionnaire box, and then once you add the client to the system, it would send off an email to them that would say, click here to access your questionnaire. So you would click on the link and then it would bring them to their questionnaire. So they'd be prompted to create a password just so that their information stays secure and so that they can come back into it at any time. So they don't have to complete it all in one setting. And then they go through it. So they put in all their profile, family tree, asset, and debt information. And anything they fill out in their questionnaire will automatically populate back into your system. But you don't have to send the client the questionnaire. So just don't worry about putting in their email and don't click this use questionnaire box. And then you can use whatever your current system is. So if you have like a PDF or a Word questionnaire that you send over to them, or maybe you like to do it live in the meeting with them, then you can do that as well. So it's up to you. But if you do want to send it, you just put in their email and click the use questionnaire box. And then the contributors thing down at the bottom, this is if you have multiple users on your account and not everybody's an admin, and you sort of want to restrict access to certain files. But if you're not worried about that, I would probably recommend making everyone an admin just so that they've got the privilege of seeing all the clients so you don't have to worry about giving certain access to some people and not others. But the function is there if that's what you want to do. Then we'll go ahead and add in the bottom corner. And since we're doing a spouse client file today, this means that we're doing wills for both spouses. So this means that we have to add both spouses as separate clients in the system. If you were just doing one of their wills and the other one was a beneficiary in it, you don't have to add them both as clients to the system. This is only if you're doing both of their wills. So let's go ahead and add the spouse in. So go add, let's call her Lauren Collins. And then the key thing here is this spouse client feature. So you're going to click on it and then you're going to pick the name of the first spouse from the system. So it's going to list all of your clients that are single, that aren't tied to anyone else, but you're going to want to pick the name of the other spouse. And you can only do this spouse client function when you are adding the second spouse to the system, since you have to be able to select the first spouse's name from the drop-down list. And then we'll go ahead and add in the bottom corner. And now they're both in the system. So you have to pick, who are we going to start with? Today, let's pick Ben. So you're just going to click on their name and it's going to bring you into their profile. And you're going to see whatever the clients filled out in the questionnaire. So if they built out an entire family tree, that's what you'd see when you clicked on their profile. But if you hadn't sent the questionnaire or they hadn't filled it out yet, this is what you'd be starting with. So in a spouse client file, you'd start with the client and the spouse. In a single client file, you just start with the client. And usually what I would do first is edit the client's information. And to do that, you can just double click on the client's icon or the icon of the individual that you want to edit. And it's going to bring up all of these details. So the key things are going to be first name, last name, and gender. So for anyone on the family tree, you're going to want to make sure those fields are filled out because they have an effect on the will. The also known as field, if Ben is also known as Benny Collins, this will appear in the will as well. So you can fill out that field if you want that coming up in the will. Date of birth, you can pick it from this little calendar, but I find it easier to just type it in. So June 6th, 1967, and then it will automatically populate that age for you. Then country of birth, you can pick whatever country. Citizenship, you can do multiple citizenships or just one country. All of this other stuff, this is good information to have on your client for your client file. Law Pro recommends it, but it won't affect anything in the generation of the will. So this is more just for information for your file. If we scroll down here to residency, this is important because however you set the province as is how the probate tax gets calculated throughout the system. But also, if you're from Nova Scotia or BC, you're going to want to make sure this is changed to the correct residency because then it will generate the either BC or Nova Scotia precedents instead of Ontario. So the default will always be set to Ontario, but if you're from either of those provinces, you're going to want to change it to make sure the correct precedent populates. Then for city, if we want it to say Ben Collins from the city of Toronto in the will, we're going to type out that city field because this will populate in the will. Address and postal code just for information. Then special circumstances. So for the client, the special circumstances section is a place where you can note any potential capacity issues. So you're going to want to make sure those are well documented. You just click off on the button and you type a description in below. So again, it doesn't affect the generation of the will, but really good information to have on your file, especially if you're suspecting there might be a will challenge down the line. Then lastly is direct relationships, and it's just going to list who they are tied to on the family tree. So right now it tells us that Ben is married to Lauren and Lauren's the only other person on the family tree right now. Then we'll click save. So next, let's say I wanted to add a client. So whoever the blue circle, a child, sorry, whoever the blue circle is around is who you're going to be adding to. So to get the blue circle around someone, you just click once on their icon, and then it means you're adding to that individual. If you double click, that'll bring up more information. So to get the blue circle, you just want to click once. And then you go up to your add button and you select the relationship to them. So if we're adding Ben's child in, we're going to go down and click child. And then whenever you're adding a child, it's always going to ask you who the other parent is. So you've got three choices. You can pick Lauren Collins, who's the current spouse. You can pick a new parent, so maybe an ex-spouse that's going to be involved in the will, or you can put them as a single parent. So either they're genuinely a single parent or the ex-spouse is not going to be involved in the will, so you don't have to add them to the family tree. But let's say today it's Lauren is the other parent. And now we'll have to add the child's information in. So first name, John Collins, let's say gender male, date of birth, June 8th, 2000. And then we'll go ahead and, one other thing to point out, the special circumstances section, for anyone that's not the client, this is a place where you can note relationship difficulties, that kind of thing, which is again, good information to have. Especially if you think things are uneven or there might be a will challenge down the line. But the most important thing here is this disability function. So you're going to want to make sure that this little button is clicked off if you're going to try to do a Henson Trust or any planning for a disabled beneficiary down the line. That way, once you mark it off here, the system recognizes that this individual is disabled. And if you set up a trust for them and you set it up with unlimited discretion and the duration to death of beneficiary, then it's going to draft that special hence and trust wording because it recognizes that the individual is disabled here. So this is the key trigger, this little button. And then we'll go ahead and add. Now, if you look at your add list, you might notice that there's no option for a grandchild or a niece and nephew, but there's still a way to get them on the family tree. You just have to do it by direct relationships. So instead of adding a grandchild directly to Ben, you have to add a child to Ben, then click once on the child's icon to get that blue circle around, and add a child to the child. And that's how you get the grandchild in. So we're going to go add child. Let's say he's a single parent. And now we enter John's child, aka Ben's grandchild, into the system. So let's say her name is Lily Collins, female, and we'll just go ahead and add. Same kind of thing for nieces and nephews. You would just add a sibling to Ben, and then you'd click on the siblings icon and add a child to that sibling. That's how you'd get nieces and nephews onto the tree. Now, for anyone that's going to be a part of the will in either a beneficiary or a trustee capacity that doesn't fit on the family tree, so either they're really distant family or they're not family at all, they're a friend or a colleague or something like that, you're going to add them over in this other section. So that way, later on, when you're choosing beneficiaries or trustees, they'll be a part of the drop-down list because their information will be in the system. But since they're not family, you just add them over on this other tab. So you go add person. Let's say Jordy's going to be a trustee later on, so we're going to add him in here. Jordy Ayton. Let's say he's a friend. And then we'll go ahead and add. So that's sort of the people section, but does anyone have any questions so far? Feel free to either unmute yourself or send it through the Zoom chat. Nope? Okay. Then we'll move on to assets. Oh, can we see the questionnaire that clients get? So if you add yourself as a client or just add a fake client and put your email in, as long as it's an email that's not the same one associated with your user account. So if you've got like a secondary Gmail or something, then you can just put in your email, click the use questionnaire box, and then you'll see what kind of questionnaire clients get. If someone doesn't have a middle name, you don't have to put the middle name in. No, there won't be a not applicable if someone doesn't have a middle name. You just don't fill out the middle name field. It's just there in case they do. But if they don't, you don't have to put anything in there. Yeah, it won't say NA or anything. If you leave it blank, it just won't include a middle name. Okay. Let's go to the asset section next. So we're just going to click the three bars and we're going to go to assets. And you're always going to start with the general personal effects asset just to remind you to gift it specifically to someone in the system, because that's how you trigger the special general personal effects clause that comes up in the will. So the asset section is kind of depending on what you want to do here. So if you've got a really big client, maybe they're really wealthy, you want to lay out all of their assets, show them sort of the rough value of their estate at this point in time, what's going where, then you can add all of the assets in, put values on them, and then that visual summary that comes out is really valuable. If you're doing a really simple estate where it's mostly just dealing with residue, everything to spouse, everything to kids, you don't need to add in every single asset to the system. The only assets that you do need to add are going to be those that are specific asset bequests. So if you're going to give away your house specifically in the will and you want that as a specific asset bequest, you'd have to add it as an asset first so that later on when we get to the scenario section, you'll be able to gift it because it'll be in the system. So let's add a couple. We'll go to add. Then you pick which asset type, and then you pick the category and then you pick the type within it. So I'm going to pick bank account. The key thing to note when adding an asset is the asset name field. So that's really the most important, especially if you're gifting it specifically in the will. Because whatever you put in the asset name is not only how it's referred to throughout the system, but also how it's generated if you're giving it specifically in the will. So instead of just calling it bank account, I would usually change it so it's like RBC bank account, whatever the account number is. So that way, if I add multiple bank accounts to the system, they're not all going to be called bank account, and I'm not going to get confused as to which one is which. So all this other stuff below, details, financial institution, this is just for information for that profile summary, but the asset name is really the key thing that matters for the will. Then if you put the balance in, you're going to notice that that probate tax is calculated for you based on whatever you've set the client's residency as. So since we put Ontario, it's according to Ontario law. And then we'll go ahead and just add this asset. So let's say it's solely owned. Next, let's do a house. So we'll go real estate, home. Again, however you put the asset name will be how it's referred to if you're gifting it specifically. So maybe I want to call it the family home. You putting an address in, that will populate in the will as well if you are gifting it specifically. When you're putting in the current value, let's say it's $1 million, again, the probate tax is automatically calculated for you. And then on real estate, you have this special field called mortgage/encumbrances. So if there is a mortgage on the property, I would put whatever the value of the mortgage is in this field here, just because it has a direct effect on the probate tax, and it's good to know what mortgage that specific asset is associated with. So there is an option to add a mortgage later on when you get to the debt section, but I would avoid that. I would add it here in this field if it is associated with this specific asset, just because of the implications that I talked about. The one thing is just make sure you're not adding it in both sections. So don't add it in this field and also add it as a separate debt in the debt section. Just add it in one of the places, but it's best to really just add it in the field here. And then let's say this ownership, let's say it's joint with the spouse. So we're going to change it to joint. And then you just click right on where it says add owner, and it's going to bring up everyone you've added to the system, either on the family tree or the other tab. We're going to say Lauren is the joint owner. So always when adding a beneficiary, an owner, or something like that, click right on the line and on the text that says add owner or add beneficiary, and avoid using this person plus button, because if you've already added them to the system, you're going to want to make sure you select them from the drop down. You don't want to add a new person. So key thing is just remember, click on the line. Then we'll add. Lastly, let's do one more. Let's say we're going to do an Rrsp. So later on, we're going to be able to determine whether or not we want these Rrsps to either be confirmed or have a new designation done in the will. But in order to do that, you need to add them as an asset to the system. So let's say, again, we're going to call it like the RBC Rrsp, because if we're adding multiple, we want to be able to differentiate it. So that asset name change is key. This beneficiary field, this is just for current information. So it's just information purposes. Whoever the current beneficiary is on the policy, you could type it in. It doesn't affect anything in the actual system itself. Let's say current value, again, 100,000. So the probate tax, you notice it always calculates, but the income tax doesn't. And this is just due to the variability of different clients' tax brackets, stuff like that. So usually if we're dealing with an asset with a capital gain, we put like 25% of that gain. If we're doing something like an RSP, probably put in 50% of that, just as a high estimate of the tax. So we're not tax experts or anything like that. It's just showing the client sort of what they might be looking at. And it's going to change based on how this asset is either designated or if it's joint, if we were talking about another asset. And we're going to see that tax get deducted accordingly. So that's assets. Does anyone have any questions about assets? Nope. Okay. Then we'll move on to debts. So again, debts doesn't really have an effect on the generation of the document, but it does have an effect on the summaries, and it's more for the planning purposes. So you just go to add debt. Remember, we're not going to add the mortgage again because we don't want to double count it. We already added it in the asset section. But let's say there's a credit card debt. So we'll just say credit card, say it's a $5,000 balance, and we'll add. So that's debts. Then where you get to the real planning stuff, this is the scenarios section. So in the scenarios, there's basically at most these 3 scenarios that you plan for. So that way, no matter what happens when the client passes away, you have all of your bases covered. So you start with surviving spouse, and this is the plan if the spouse is alive when the client passes away. Then you go to descendants only. This is the plan if the spouse is gone, but there's still kids or grandkids around. And then lastly is your no descendants. So you don't necessarily always get to this one if you have a big family, but this is like your ultimate disaster, what happens here. And by planning for each of these scenarios, you're going to cover your bases no matter what happens. So if you go into surviving spouse first, we're going to see that it's blank. And we could just start from scratch and do it that way. But there's another thing we could do instead, and that's our new e-plans feature. So that's this little lightning bolt up in the top corner. And if we click on it, we've got a couple of different options. I know we just added in a couple more with separated spouses. But for those that where you're dealing with a spouse and kids, there's these 3 options right now. And basically what an e-plan does is it goes through each scenario and the appointments sections and creates the plan for you according to whatever it says here. So say for example, we have a spouse, we're dealing with a spouse with younger children. So if we click to this one, it will go in and do all of the planning for us. So it would have the surviving spouse scenario, everything to the spouse, absolutely. In the descendants only scenario, it would create a trust for the kids to age 25. And then in the no descendants, it would be half to spouse's siblings and half to the client's siblings. And so even if this is not exactly what you're trying to do, even if it's kind of close, it is a really good starting point because that way you don't have to start from scratch. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to run this one. So I like most of this one, and then we're just going to change any details you want. So by running the e-plan, it's not set in stone. It's really designed to give you a good foundation or starting point. It's great if it's a simple client file and it pretty much meets what you're trying to do. But even if it's not, even if it's more complicated, it gives you a start. So now we're going to click on surviving spouse, and it's not empty anymore because we ran that e-plan. So there's sort of 3 sections in each scenario that you go through. The first is joint designated assets. So this is where any joint or designated assets go because anything that's falling outside of the estate goes in this section. So if we see, because we ran that e-plan, it's going to pull anything that is joint with the spouse, and it's going to say that this RSP was designated to the spouse, and it's going to automatically pull those into Lauren's thing right here. So that saves us time. We don't have to do it ourselves. Then initial gifts, we have the general personal effects. The e-plan automatically gifts the general personal effects to the spouse in this scenario. And that's good because we want those general personal effects in the initial gift section if we want the special general personal effects clause to populate in the will. Then the last thing is the balance of the estate. So right now, if we want to see what the details are, you just click on the 2 gray bars and it's going to bring it up. It's telling us that the gift is absolute to Lauren 100%. We don't need to put a gift over in for this scenario because the descendants only scenario is covering what we would do in the gift over situation if the spouse weren't alive. So that's surviving spouse. It pretty much planned it for us. A lot of situations are going to have everything going 100% to the spouse. So that e-plan is really helpful because we don't really have to make any changes here. Then we'll go up to surviving spouse. We'll go to the next scenario, descendants only. So probably not any joint or designated assets. But for the initial gifts, it's gifted the general personal effects to the children. And let me just show you how you would do it if you didn't do the E-plan. So any assets that you added to the system would appear as these green boxes over here. You just pick whatever asset you wanted to gift specifically, drag it over, and then click right on the beneficiaries line. And you could either name the children specifically, or you could scroll down and pick the class of children instead. And then you just add. Then the last part, the residue. So we're going to check what the E-plan ran. So it's got a trust for the children, 100%, same trustees as the executors, and the duration is to when the beneficiary reaches age 25. So let's say I like that plan, but I kind of want to do a stage at age 21. I want them to get something at 21. So I'm going to go to mandatory payments and go stage lump sums at certain ages. I'll add a stage at age 21. I'm going to do a percentage. I'm going to give them 25%. So that way I have the starting point, but I was still able to go in and make a change so that it fits what's right for my client. And then the gift over right now for the E-plan is first to beneficiaries issue, and then if not to other class members, meaning the other children in the class. So this looks good. We'll save that. And since I made a change here, I'm going to also want to probably copy that change over to Lauren's will as well. And that's where this special spouse syncing button comes in. So because we synced them at the beginning with that spouse client function, we link them together, you're going to get this special sync button. So for each scenario, you can basically copy everything you've done in that scenario over to the spouse's will as well. So you're not starting from scratch when you go in to review theirs. So we're just going to copy. So we're going to sync, and it's going to copy everything here over to Lauren's with that change that we made to the trust. So that's descendants only. Then we'll go no descendants. And this is the situation. This is your ultimate disaster. Everyone's gone. And the way the E-plan does it, it fills out the residue as going 50% to siblings, 50% to spouses' siblings. But let's say that's not really what I wanted to do at all. So I'm just going to go clear, and it's going to clear just the residue section in this scenario. I'm going to start from scratch. So if you're ever dividing up the residue from scratch, you have to basically create segments. So it's kind of how you're dividing things up, and then create gifts within those segments. So you're specifying what's happening to that portion. So let's say I wanted to give 50% to Jordy and 50% to a charity. So I'm going to create two segments. So the first segment will be of 50%. And now I'm going to add a gift to basically specify the details of this segment. I'm going to choose Jordy as the beneficiary. 100%. So some people get confused here, but this just means 100% of the 50% segment. So we're not dividing it up even further. So you're going to keep this as 100 if you want all 50% to go to Jordy. And then maybe we'll put in a gift over to his issue. And we'll go add. So now we've dealt with 100% of this 50%. So we don't want to add any more gifts because we don't have any percentages left in this segment. But we have to go back to the main segments page, which is this grayed out little segments button here. That's going to bring you back. And then you go to the add segment button, segment 2 for 50%. And then we'll add a gift within that segment. So if the charity is already in the system, you can scroll down to the bottom here. But if not, you just go to the 3 dots, then you go new charity. Let's say I'm going choosing Epilepsy Toronto. If you do have the CRA number, just type it on this line. Don't worry about the ID field because it doesn't actually do anything. So just type it directly on the name line if you have it and you want it to come up in the will. And then we'll add. So now we've dealt with 100% of this 50% and therefore 100% of everything. And we can sync it over to Lauren as well. So that was a lot, but does anyone have any questions about the scenarios section? Nope. Okay, don't be shy if you do. Then we'll just go to the next section, which is appointments. So you just click on appointments. Because we ran that e-plan, it's put Lauren as the primary estate trustee. But let's say we still want to add an alternate. So you go add, you pick your alternate, let's say it's Jordy. For condition, if you wanted them to be a joint primary with Lauren, you pick none. So you always need to appoint a primary first, and to appoint them, you put none as condition as a primary. But if they're going to be an alternate, then you have to put a different condition on it. So usually I pick if all specified cannot act, that's the one I use. And then it's going to say if Lauren can't act, then Jordy. And you just play around with the conditions based on if you're trying to do a further alternate, if you're trying to do a joint alternate or a joint primary, you just play with the condition. And the spouse sync button for appointments is actually in the bottom corner here. So we're just going to click Lauren's name and we'll sync it over. How do you add a further alternate? That was a question. So then you would just go add, we'd pick whoever a further alternate is. Then you'd say if all specified cannot act, you change the specified to Jordy instead of Lauren. And then it would be Lauren if Lauren can't act, Jordy if Jordy can't act, John. No problem. So then provisions, there's a couple of things here. The first is funeral arrangements. So if you want those in the will, you can just type them right on that line there. But if not, just get rid of the text and there won't be a body disposition clause in the will. Include future members. This is if you are dealing with like a young couple, you think that they're probably going to have future children. You use the class of children when you are gifting to the kids. And basically, if you click this box, when it defines children in the will, it'll say my children, John, and any other child born to me and Lauren. So that's how it will define it. It will include future children. Same with the other classes. Class restrictions. So this is the same kind of thing. If you want to restrict certain members of being a class, so posthumously conceived children or children born out of wedlock. Trust for beneficiaries under a certain age. This is your general trust clause, so it'll govern underage beneficiaries that haven't had specific trusts set up for them. So you can change the duration if you want. It won't affect anything you've set up in the will, any specific trusts. It'll just be like if it goes to a grandchild through a gift over and they're underage, it'll follow this general trust clause. And then the last thing, secondary will assets. So this is if you are doing multiple wills, primary and secondary, then here you can pick and choose which definitions you want included in the secondary will. If you're just doing a single will, you don't need to worry about clicking or unclicking anything. It won't have any effect. So you can just leave it as is. And the last two things are powers of attorney, which work the exact same way as the appointment section where you just pick your primary and your alternate. Then up here, this little exclamation point, these are what we call advisor insights. And it's sort of like a checklist based on what kind of information you're putting in the system. It's going to prompt you on certain planning things. So if we missed putting in something like a gender, it's going to tell us about that. So we can go back and fix that, and this will go away. But not all of them go away, and they don't have any effect on the actual generation of the will. It's more just for your knowledge for planning things. So it can be really useful there. The next thing is just notes. So if you wanted to make any notes on your client, you could just type it in here. Maybe you wanted to check a spelling of a name or note that you had done a title search, something like that. You just type it in. And these notes do appear at the end of the text summary. And the last button is the sort of the download button. And you can generate documents or summaries. So there's 3 summaries that you can generate, first of all. The first one's the profile summary, and it's going to give you a nice PDF of all the information that you put in the system. So either that, basically it's anything that your clients filled out in the questionnaire or that you filled out for them like we did today. So profile information, family tree, assets, and debts. So it's good for your file. It's just got all of that kind of information. The second one is the graphic scenario summary. So if you're putting in values on assets and stuff like that, it's really useful because it's going to give you, for each scenario, a nice overview of the estate, sort of the net value, what's going where. So it's a pretty visual too. Clients tend to like that. So if you're doing a lot of planning with the system and you really want to show the clients sort of the implications and what's going where and values, rough values, this is really great for that. And the last thing is the text scenario summary. So it's going to give you essentially the will without the legalese. It's just got all the details on everything you've done in the system. So it can be sort of a more digestible format for the clients to understand sort of what's happening in their estate plan. So those are the summaries. And then the documents, you just go back to the download button, documents. Sometimes you'll get this message on the fee. If you're on a trial, don't worry about it. And these are all the documents that you can generate with the system. So today we're going to do single will. Signing date, you can always change that. You can take it out. You can always actually change it manually in the will later if that kind of changes. So it's not set in stone or anything like that. Registered asset designation. This is if you want to either confirm or change the designation of the registered assets in the will, then you'd include this clause. Joint designated asset confirmation, it's just a clause saying that any assets that are joint are truly intended to be joint kind of thing. So if you're dealing with a client who's got a lot of assets that are joint with an adult child and you don't want them held on a resulting trust, you can include that clause. Counterpart execution, it's if you're signing in counterpart under the new legislation. Simplified provisions is a shorter will. It's got less definitions and powers. It's just simpler. So if you're not doing any trusts and you want a shorter will, you can do that. Will guide is a nice little guide at the end of the will for the clients. So it's a little chart that tells them each clause in the will and its purpose. And the last is the cover page. So it's just a cover page to the will. Whoever's marked as a primary contributor on the file, that's whose name will appear on the cover page. And then the witnesses, you can pick anyone else who's a user on your account. If you just want to manually fill it in the will, if whoever's going to witness isn't a user, you just click this blank box and then you can manually change it in the will. And then you can always include your affidavits of execution as well. Then you just click generate and it's going to give you a will. And it's a Word document, so you can make any changes that you want. If you wanted to change a clause, if you wanted to change wording, it's totally up to you. You can make any changes that you want because it's fully editable. So here's your cover page. Funds and plans, because we checked that registered asset box. Assets passing outside of the will, because we checked that joint asset box. Definitions and interpretations. When we talk about my children, because we selected future children, it says my children means John Collins and any other child born to or adopted by Lauren Collins and me. Here's our trustees. So if Lauren, then if not Lauren, Jordy. Here's our funeral arrangements clause. I desire that my body be cremated. If you don't include the text, it won't come up. Disposition and personal effects. So the reason you're getting this little red highlight is just because it wants to draw your attention to it, because you have to make a decision here whether or not you want the division of the personal effects to be in the trustee's discretion, or if you want to implement some sort of lottery system or something like that, then you'd include A, B, C, or you'd take those out depending on what you want to do. Residue to Lauren. If not to Lauren, then the trust for the children. And lastly, ultimate distribution to Jordy. If not to Jordy, then to Epilepsy Toronto. And then if we scroll all the way down, it's going to have our will guide for the clients. So that's sort of how you'd go through it. And then you would go back and you would switch over to Lauren's, go through hers, make sure you didn't want to make any changes. And then you'd go and generate her documents as well. And one other thing to note is if you ever do get stuck, you can always email me or support, but you can also check out this little question mark button up in the top corner. So if you click on it, it brings you over to our help desk, and it's got a lot of sort of articles on how you do different things in the system. So like, how do I create a Henson Trust? It's going to tell you step by step, this is what you do. Sometimes there's pictures, and that can be a helpful resource if you're struggling with something. But you can, of course, also always just email me or support directly. So does anyone have any questions before we wrap things up? Life insurance declaration document. So it's just, we don't include a life insurance clause in the will. So if you want to sort of generate that document, then you don't have to give the entire will to the insurance company for the life insurance policy. If you're doing a new designation, you can just generate the life insurance declaration document instead. So you would add the life insurance as an asset, and then you would go ahead and generate that document. And yeah, exactly.
Sorry, can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. Um, I'm just wondering because I joined it late. Is this like the information you're getting from an intake sheet or something that they provided?
So yeah, so you can use our online questionnaire to send them.
Oh, and then when they send it back, you use that to enter.
Yeah, so they don't need to send it back, just it's automatic. Anything they fill out will automatically populate into your system. But yeah, that's
Oh,
how you can get all the information.
okay. All right. Thank you.
Any other questions before we wrap up? No? Okay. Well, I'd like to just thank everyone for joining me then. And if you do have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out at any time. I'm always happy to jump on a Zoom and walk you through it. So thanks again for joining me, and I hope everyone has a great day.
Thank you. You too.